Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anton Löf, and I'm here to talk a little bit about diamond rents. But let me also thank the organizers and the beautiful country of Angola for having me here today. Could we change slide, please? Oh, sorry. We did a study that was commissioned by United Nations University. Oh, thank you. And it was published early 2021. And it discusses diamond rents. And this is my topic today. But just to tell you who I am. RMG Consulting and its predecessor, Raw Materials Group, has been around for roughly 40 years. And we've worked on policies in various countries, as well as in the actual mining industry. The extractive industries are a means to an end. Countries want minerals and metals, as well as oil and gas, to develop their societies and increase the standard of living for their populations. And this is whether or not it's a producing or a consuming country. But the traditional indicator of economic progress, growth in gross domestic product, can be problematic for countries with an extractive sector. These countries can grow their GDP by diminishing their stocks of non-renewable resources. And without new investments into the sector and a balanced tax regime, these stocks of non-renewable resources will be reduced and the sector will slowly die out. However, there are ways to get around this problem, and the concept of wealth that includes a value of existing resources not yet developed on a country level can be a powerful tool to analyze and plan for the sector. The World Bank, in their report series, The Changing Wealth of Nations, they estimate that on an aggregate level, around 20% of the wealth in developing nations are attributed to natural resources. And the report stresses the important role of natural capital in building wealth. And this suggests that natural capital should receive close attention by governments. So using the concept of wealth, which they do in these reports, we need to discuss and calculate economic rents. There we go. So economic rent can be defined as those payments to a factor of production. This is a bit technical, but bear with me. That are in excess of the minimum payment necessary to have that factor supplied. This means that economic rents can be taxed without the producer changing his or her economic behavior. Schematically, it can be visualized as a difference between the opportunity cost and the price at each given output. But it is important to understand that these costs, they should include a return on capital, on invested capital. So rents arise only when supply is somewhat inelastic. And in the mineral resource sector, this is mainly geological. One resource is better than the other. However, calculating resource rents can be very problematic. And depending on whether you look at this in the short or the long run, these will display very different characteristics. In the short run, they can be very high, but in the long run, they tend to disappear almost completely. but not completely. Economic rent can be defined as total income subtracted by total cost. And total income, you can calculate that through total production times average price. And total income, that's fairly straightforward. For most minerals, there exist production figures and some sort of price. And in the diamond industry, we have the Kimberley process that publishes these figures. Oh, damn. There. Sorry. Total cost is, however, different. In the long term, all costs should be included when calculating a sustainable rent, the pure rent. But for practical reasons, all costs are seldom included in resource rent calculations. Most calculations of resource rents take as a starting point individual mines and its operating costs. However, this leaves out other costs linked to mining, for example, overheads, as well as cost of capital. And the World Bank series I mentioned, they exclude these costs for practical reasons. So there is thus no inclusion of cost of capital, overhead costs, closure costs, nor explorations, for example, in these reports. So the conclusion is that the rent that is presented in the World Bank report series, they are not sustainable over the long term. And this would overestimate the potential taxable space and could lead to too little investments in sustaining operations and close down mines or oil fields. And this is, of course, detrimental for any country that relies on the income of this industry. The diamond industry is interesting. It represents a relatively small part of the entire extractive sectors. I must point out that this excludes oil and gas, and it is the value at the mine. So I'm not including here the value or the polished or the sort of gem quality, but this is raw diamonds. However, as you are well aware of, it's very important for certain countries: Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Sierra Leone, and Angola. All these countries derive significant revenue streams from the diamond industry. And this industry could grow in these countries. But for these countries, an increased understanding of the diamond rent would be of importance, especially since resource rents are, as we pointed out, directly related to the opportunity of levied taxes. So when we started writing this report, we wanted to discuss resource rents in the diamond industry. And using the Kimberley process, we had access to production volumes and average values. However, we, as did the World Bank earlier, we lacked costs. And the costs that we defined as the total cost of the mining industry were, as you see here, operating costs, cost of capital, exploration costs, overhead costs, and closure costs. All these needs to be included for the rent to be sustainable. But what we had was a method, and we read through basically all the data that we could find that was publicly available. And in the end, we could establish the average costs in the diamond industry on a global level. And as you can see, operation costs are the main costs, and you have cost of capital. And the third cost is overhead. However, for example, closure costs are barely seen in this graph. But these costs could then be recalculated so that costs in US dollars per carat could be established. And applying these steps and remembering that rent is total income subtracted by total cost, we could calculate the global diamond rent. And if you look at if you look at diamond rent as a percentage of total value of the diamond industry, we can see that rents have been decreasing lately or over the period. And this, of course, this has to do with the rising costs, if you remember the earlier slide I showed you. But as pointed out earlier, rents is basically a deduction of costs. And if we're not including all costs, we're overestimating the rent. This is shown here. The bottom darker red, that's a pure rent. That's a sustainable rent. While the higher, the orange plus the red, that's sort of the rent using the method of the World Bank report. And here you can see the difference between those two as a percentage. And of course, if you think that the rent is that high, you want to tax the industry more than they can, and they will die out. So you need to find a balance here. So in conclusion, only pure rent can be taxed without changing the economic behavior of the investor. Thus, it is important not to overestimate rent or the taxable space. We must point out also that direct taxes and royalties, they are just part of what the industry brings to a country. There's also job opportunities, workforce, education, income taxes. All of these are important parts. And the industry's ability to operate over the long term hinges on a well-balanced tax policy and officials' understanding of the rent earned by the industry. Companies need to make money. But we should not forget that mineral wealth under most jurisdictions belong to the state, the country, or the people. Thus, levying tax on rent, or if you want to see it like that, that's an excess profit. That shouldn't be too problematic. Taxes, it should be a win-win situation. Companies get an educated workforce, they get infrastructure, and as the minister pointed out, institutions. What the country gets, the country gets taxes. So while our study established a global diamond rent, we could only hint at rents in individual countries. Diamonds come in many shapes and qualities, and understanding the individual diamond mining country, its industry with its specific costs and incomes, that was beyond our study. But what the study did was to collect as much data as possible and apply that to any mine, etc., where data was lacking. So we could calculate a global average. But on a country-by-country level, the data might be exaggerated or too low. However, the study did establish a method, and that method can be applied to any country. Because it's important for individual countries and governments to have a clear understanding of what the national extractive resources are, how much they can produce, and how much they may yield to the state from year to year. Resource rents can in this case be seen as an indicator that can give an understanding of the total tax burden an industry can manage without jeopardizing the future of said industry. So we do encourage all involved to have a good look at these rents as a means to plan ahead. And I want to leave you with a picture of my grandmother's mother. That's her in the middle of the picture in white shirt. This picture was taken at an iron ore mine in Sweden, 1903, I think. This is how it looked then. This is how it looks now in Sweden. We want to develop our societies. Thank you.